Good evening, and welcome to the Sheldon Museum of Art. I am Melissa Ewan, Associate Curator of Exhibitions. Tonight, I am thrilled to be able to introduce what promises to be a riveting program, a live taping of the Modern Art Notes podcast with host Tyler Green and multimedia artist Tiffany Chung. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Nebraska is a land-grant institution with campuses and programs on the past, present, and future homelands of the Pawnee, Ponca, Oto-Missouri, Omaha, Dakota, Lakota, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Kaw peoples, as well as the relocated Ho-Chunk, Iowa, Sac, and Fox peoples. Please take a moment to consider the legacies of more than 150 years of displacement, violence, settlement, and survival that bring us together here today. This acknowledgement and the centering of Indigenous peoples is a start as we move forward together. I would also like to thank all of those who made possible this event, which is associated with one of Sheldon's fall exhibitions, Unquiet Harmony, the Subject of Displacement. Exhibition support for Unquiet Harmony was provided by Assurity, Kristen and Jeff Klein, Roseanne and Phil Perry, and Annette and Paul Smith. Sheldon's Anne Gradwall and Abigail Groth were instrumental in the planning of tonight's program, which has been made possible by the Hickson Lead Endowment, Martin and Ruth Messingale Art Education and Outreach Fund, Pace Woods Foundation, and member support of the Sheldon Art Association. Thank you to those of you here today who are members. Our guests tonight are Tiffany Chung and Tyler Green, who will be in conversation about her career and artwork on view here at Sheldon. The dialogue we experience tonight will be available as episode 413 of the Modern Art Notes podcast on the podcast platform of your choice beginning October 3rd. Multimedia artist Tiffany Chung is one of Vietnam's most celebrated contemporary artists. She is best known for her cartographic drawings, sculptures, videos, and performances that investigate migration, displacement, and conflict, which are the result of war, human destruction, or natural disaster. Chung's work has been featured in the 2015 Venice Biennale, the 2016 Art Basel Hong Kong, and the 2018 Sydney and Gwangju Biennials. Most recently, she presented a major solo show titled Tiffany Chung, Vietnam, Past is Prologue at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., and she currently has a show, Passage of Time, on view at Tyler Rollins Fine Art in New York City. Her conversation partner tonight is Tyler Green, the award-winning critic, historian, and host and producer of the podcast Modern Art Notes. This podcast has been recognized by the BBC as one of the world's top 25 cultural podcasts and was the recipient of one of the 2 inaugural awards for art criticism distributed by the U.S. chapter of the International Association of Art Critics. Additionally, he is the author of the award-winning book Carlton Watkins, Making the West American, published in 2018 by the University of California Press. Tomorrow morning at 9:30, he will return to Sheldon in this auditorium to present a talk on Watkins, which is also open to the public. And 2 final notes before we begin tonight's program. We will have time for audience questions at the conclusion of the speaker's conversation. I kindly ask that you wait for a microphone so that everyone is able to hear you clearly. And please also fill out the feedback forms you received when entering the museum. These forms are very useful for us when we plan our future programming. And so, without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming to the stage Tiffany Chung and Tyler Green. Can I sit?
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Can we hear me? Yes? Can we hear Tiffany?
Hi, and thanks for coming. Thanks for the introduction, Melissa.
Right, as Melissa said, this is next week's podcast. Our show tomorrow is LaToya Ruby Frazier, who has a show of new work about the Lordstown, Ohio GM plant and the UAW's and what's going on there. That's tomorrow's show, so this will be a week from tomorrow. We are going to have images running in sequence behind us. So the audience is, of course, all of us here, but the audience is also in 8 days, many tens of thousands of people. So what we usually do when we do live audience shows is have images going behind us, and we'll just kind of naturally, you'll recognize things that we're talking about as we talk. And with that, Tiffany Chung, welcome to the Modern Art Notes podcast.
Hi, Tyler. Thank you.
Your work often addresses themes of migration and displacement, even diaspora. Is that related to your family history? And could you give us maybe a quick short biography that kind of lays out a roadmap of that for us?
Well, to answer that question, first of all, I'm a former Vietnamese refugee. My family came to the US after the fall of Saigon in 1975. Whether that plays a lot into my work, yes and no. For the first decade of my practice, I refused to let the conflict in Vietnam and my own family history to shape the expectation of the audience that I'm only capable of doing work relates to the war or the migration. And deeper than that, it's the thing when history affected your family so personally, it takes a lot of time to process. So I began to look into it in 2010 with a project that is called Scratching the Walls of Memory. So that was the first time I really confronted the war, head on. But I would have to put that on hold for a number of years before I came back to it. So basically what I'm trying to say is that it takes time to process memory and trauma, and also you can only do it when you're ready.
About a decade ago, the art historian T.J. Clark gave a series of Mellon lectures at the National Gallery in which he, this is the most prestigious lecture series in American art museums probably. And Clark argued that it was totally wrong and unfair for art historians or critics to consider the biography of an artist when considering the work or individual works, which is a position of a certain privilege, it must be said. How did you think through whether or not you wanted your history and your family's history to be in the work? Was there something that opened the door, something that made it, that impelled you or compelled you? How did you get to being willing to let it in?
Well, when you create the work that deals directly with conflict and migration, your history plays an important role. But whether you really negotiate the work, that history into the work, or you use it as a driving force, those are two different things. And for me, my personal history, my family history, really like a catalyst that really works through the project. But I'm not really interested in making it prominent in the work, with probably only one exception. When I created the installation that called, I kind of forgot the title, but the work that is a wall diagram that was showing at the Smithsonian. And that was, for the first time, the biographical aspect plays a role in that installation, in which I really try to understand or unpack the conflict in Vietnam through the lens of my father's experience. He was a helicopter pilot, shot down in Laos and captured and imprisoned in North Vietnam for 14 years. But even that, the whole installation was not just about him, but just using his experience to understand the war.
It was a great show. It was last year at the Vietnam. At the same time, curator Melissa Ho's American Art in the Vietnam War show was up. I lived in Washington for a very long time. Don't anymore, but it was one of the best things I've ever seen there.
Thank you.
About that experience of making work about the war and in the context of other artists going back 50 years addressing the war, Americans don't often talk about or think about the people on behalf of whom Americans believed they were fighting the war. There are lots of reasons for that. I mean, plenty of Americans thought they were fighting the domino theory rather than a conflict that involved actual people. As you thought about the absence of South Vietnamese people from American constructed narratives, were there, what ways did you consider of kind of foregrounding and presenting the South Vietnamese experience of the war?
Do you mean how I presented that or why I presented that?
Yeah, the two, both of those.
Well, the narrative has always been about the Americans that went into the war and the official account of the war through the government of Vietnam, the current government. So we have the voice of South Vietnamese, and believe me, we're very loud. We're not that quiet, but again, we were being disremembered. So it's not so much about not having a voice, but about not being heard, right? So I think that's a very important reason for me to foreground that. And I mean, I was less interested in the ideology, but more about the human history, right? The kind of the collective remembrance of the war. So I went and I interviewed people, and I usually don't do direct interview and just simply present the interview videos, in other words. But history is just so real to these people. When I spoke to them, there's still a sense of urgency. So it was very difficult to think of other ways to present it, other than just simply presenting what they were saying.
You have been foregrounding migration narratives and stories around migration for a number of years now. There's the work here, which looks at the Great Plains. You've also made work about Syria and Ukraine. Why is it important to you to address and consider migration across geopolitical boundaries? Why is the South Vietnamese experience relevant to work that addresses the plains or Syria?
Well, I think the world that we live in, on one hand, is huge, but on the other hand, is very small. And I think a lot of things are interrelated and interconnected. And we look back at colonial history. It's like you could trace the same patterns in Africa, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America. So it's really difficult for us to try to separate all these different historical events. And without understanding, all these connections, and without having, having unpacked this kind of history, history tends to repeat again and again, as we see a lot. So for me, it's just like, in order to understand the Vietnam conflict, I have to see it within a larger context, a global context. And, like the Guatemala project, that's the newest project I have just launched in New York last week. Really, it's really a testament to that. when I started learning about Latin America, especially Central America, and hearing stories about how Guatemalan had to come to the U.S. and talking to the migrants, and they talk a lot about their history, and I kept asking them, "Are you sure it's not a communist regime that you're telling me about?" And they're like, "Oh no, it's very anti-communist in Guatemala," and yet the same tactics have been employed again and again. And for someone like me who lived through that communist regime, I mean, I see so many similarities. And the only thing I could think of is so it's not so much about ideology, but it's about power, right? I mean, whatever it takes to, to maintain your grip on power. So I think that those tactics are employed just to serve that purpose. And I see that similarity. So it is an example of how I came to start working on the Guatemala project because of the similarities, and also seeing how history unfolded, and the 1954 coup in Guatemala to oust President Arbenz. That was the first CIA engineer coup that was so successful that they thought they could use the same structure, the same motive for different conflicts. And look at Cuba, look at the Bay of Pigs and how horribly it failed. And also later on in the 60s, when CIA backed a coup d'etat in Vietnam, it's the same format. So to me, the similarities are there, and it's just so hard not to see the connection. I'm sorry, the answer is long, but it has to be there. I have to,
Don't be. Was it from the very start of examining these various conflict areas where you immediately understood the relationship between power and migration, often, usually forced migration, or did that come later?
It's a learning process. To me, I don't claim that I know everything, and history is just so huge. So I learned that through time. I learned through researching, reading, and doing it, and making the artworks, and slowly, tracing the patterns of power and dominance.
What about the Great Plains story attracted you?
At the time, I was looking at urban development, right? I was looking at a lot of different groups of migration in different parts of the world, and the Great Plains. I really forgot how it came about, like how I came across it. I really forgot. But by coming here, like yesterday when I was in a car from the airport to Lincoln, I realized how little I know about this region. Making this body of work, and I just feel like, do I really know much about this to be able to talk about, So, sorry, I forgot how I came across the Great Plains, but what really occurs to me that so many years have passed since I make the work, I'm still learning about it. And I talk a lot about migration, right? And a lot of my work that people know about is about conflict-induced migration. It's not so much about disaster. But one thing that I'm trying to unpack in my work or to shape policy is that how do you define a refugee, right? What constitutes someone a refugee? And I think the story of the Dust Bowl of 1930s really plays into that argument, because at the time it was called the Dust Bowl refugees, right? It was termed the Dust Bowl refugee. But later on, in a lot of studies that have conducted, after that or in the recent decades, like in the 90s, people started to talk about the migration to California. And a lot of these Dust Bowl, the Great Plains region, according to my understanding, is a region with not very populated. So the population scattered. And a lot of the migrants or a lot of the refugees that migrated west, actually not the ones that were affected directly by the Dust Bowl, right? So yeah, they experienced drought and what's the other issues that the Great Plains
Loss
dealt
of
with?
topsoil.
Right, but not all of them were, affected directly from the Dust Bowl, from the Dust Bowl counties. So therefore, okay, well, the argument is maybe we need to redefine what constitutes a refugee, right?
When I was in high school in California, where a great many Dust Bowl migrants went, I remember being taught in school two terms. Okies, even though, I don't know what the percentage of Oklahomans who migrated was, but that was the term that gets used in textbooks a lot, and migrants. And we didn't hear refugees a lot, even though there was an international process, yeah.
Right. And another debate is whether to categorize somebody as political refugee or economic migrant. How do you define that? Look at the case of the Dust Bowl, right? Was it because of economic reason or was it political reason? So I mean, to kind of separate this population, I think is quite problematic, and maybe that's why I was drawn into this Dust Bowls of the 1930s.
The biggest piece upstairs here at the Sheldon is called In Between Foraging Sites, First Raindrops and the Big 50, and it's the piece that features glass bison on an abstracted landscape, which is a white tabletop, air quotes, looking thing. Is that a fair description? Anytime you have to use air quotes and looking thing, one gets nervous. But so it's a piece that addresses the initial American migration into the plains and the peoples and the animals that were there in the 19th century. And I found myself today thinking a lot about how everything in that work serves as a counterpoint to Albert Bierstadt's famous painting from 1888, The Last Buffalo. Yours is mini bison, his is one buffalo. Yours are alive and pretty easy to see the light moving across them, and the mind conjures them as moving. And in the Bierstadt, the single final buffalo is being killed. Your landscape is abstracted, his is a plains landscape. Did you have his painting in mind at all as something to engage with or react against? Because I think that's the artwork that Americans, the single artwork that Americans most think of when they think of
the bison.
Yeah.
I'm not even familiar with that painting,
Oh,
to
cool.
tell you the truth.
Oh, cool. It's.
I think art school failed me.
You went to Long Beach State and UC Santa Barbara, so the state of California is embarrassed. Another thing about your strategy of, I don't know if strategy is the right word, another thing about your practice of addressing many migration stories and histories and not confining your practice to a single national migration story or diaspora, and how you include the Dust Bowl within that, is part of your strategy or idea is that if an American audience can empathize with and understand an American migration caused by politics or a dramatic climate event as happened in the plains in the 20th century, that American audiences might be, hopefully would be, able to differently empathize with other global migration events?
Is that a question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think race plays a major role in the literature on the Dust Bowl. The fact that the focus of the Dust Bowl was this group of European migrants to the Great Plains, and their Caucasian names and their white skin. I mean, nothing against that, but I'm just saying it used a lot in the Dust Bowl literature to gain empathy for people who could totally relate to that. But I think a lot of Americans could not relate to the same Mexican-American farmers that took over their job in California or continue that farming job. They would get less sympathy, I would say. So in a way to revisit the Great Plains and to talk about this, one thing is to bring up the issue of race. Another thing is, to remind us that disaster can strike anywhere and at any time to any of us. Today, we sit here feeling safe that we're not refugees, we're not the one who cross the Mediterranean and get drowned. But you never know what can happen to us. We can become refugees in the next decade, the next year, the next 2 years. We don't know that, right? So, to just like put that group in the context of them being refugees, us versus them, I find it disappointing. So I think it's important, this work becomes very important to me in that way, within that context of understanding the definition and the whole idea about what a refugee is.
I think the embroidered pieces put the viewer in that physical position. As you're standing looking at them, they all end visually, more or less in the year you made them, up to the present, as it were. And in each of them we see, this ocean is warming, and we know what happened last time. There was a drought caused by that kind of climate change.
Right.
Why embroidery for this?
For that project in particular, I wanted to use embroidery to depict that domestic environment of the early European migrants to the region. One thing is like the extreme climate impact. Another thing was the wrong agricultural practice that the migrant brought to the region at the time by using the technique that they brought from Europe did not work for the region, right? This region with the topsoil that was protected, the grass on the topsoil was protected by the grasses. And to practice that kind of agriculture, it's really removed, it displaced the grass. And when the windstorm came, that's what we have. We got the Dust Bowl right there. So, I don't try to simplify. There are just so many nuances. But I think, in a nutshell, that's what one would get when one tried to understand what caused the Dust Bowl. So, going back to the embroidery, I was just telling Appy today that I should have embroidered them on tablecloth. That would make the message very clear. But, I didn't know it would have been really difficult to try to present a tablecloth,
Yeah. And, there's a certain canvas tradition that puts that work within.
Will make it easier to display, to present.
Let's talk about maps. There's a great video on SF MoMA's website that you made for them, I don't know, probably about a decade ago now.
Oh, God.
And they ask you about maps, and you can't hear the person asking the question, but you laugh, and it becomes immediately clear that the question you'd been asked was, how many maps have you made? And you just said, I've made a lot of maps. And you have across much of your career. So before we get into why you make maps and what you want them to communicate, when did they become interesting to you as a form?
2007.
Oh, why then?
Well, I didn't know what I made at the time was map.
Oh, you weren't thinking of them as maps.
I was looking into urban development in Saigon. I was living in Japan at the time, and I saw some images in the newspaper when I visited home in the US, and I got images in the Vietnamese newspaper of like certain areas in Saigon under major transformation. And the change in the landscape was not even recognizable. So I thought that was so interesting. I went back to Vietnam, and I collected all the urban planning maps of that area, and I was trying to draw, the landscape. And the next thing I knew, I was just making a map without even knowing it. And that's how the map started.
And so why did you decide to continue using them, even making them kind of a real focal point of your work, at least certainly in Vietnam and Syria, and probably one or two other places?
I really like the fact that I could create a map. How many of you can do that? Can say yeah, I make maps.
Because there's an enormous amount of information within a readily understandable thing that humans the world over have used for centuries.
Right.
I mean, you can really fill the form with a lot of very complicated information.
Right. Well, joking aside, it's so much about what a map means to people, like to most of us. A map's supposed to be like very mechanical, very technical. It shows you to go from point A to point B, but in reality, maps are highly subjective.
Yeah.
So recently, I had this conversation about different projections, like the Mercator projection versus the Peters projections, and the accuracy of certain maps versus others. I mean, maps are highly subjective, and when you look at a map, it doesn't really give you the reality that a map's supposed to represent, right? So a map is actually, an abstraction of reality. And when a map's supposed to represent a place, it shaped a place. If you look at like colonial maps of the 19th century, what so-called historical maps, right? And then I was just reading this essay by Benedict Anderson. He talked about the three institutional powers, which is the census, map, and the museum. And he said how the development of census taking by building grids. So that's no longer about counting the people, right? But projecting how many people would be in certain area using the grid system to project. And later on, right, the kind of society was formed based on this colonial earlier fantasies. And it was such a powerful essay that really makes me more aware of the function that maps play.
One of the things that one of the ways I think your maps work is you don't always or often or maybe almost never give us keys.
I do.
Some, but not always.
Right.
And one of the things, you mentioned abstraction. The way abstraction works, at least for me,
right.
Is when I'm in front of a Clifford Still painting, I will try to find canyon lands because I know he's abstracting away from Western landscapes. Or when I'm looking at a 1964 Sam Gilliam, I know he was making abstractions motivated by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm looking for references to that. One of the things that I think art has taught us to do is when there's an abstraction in front of us, to use that as a reason to look carefully to find a source. Is that a process that is important to you? Do you hope that because people recognize your maps as aesthetic objects, that because they're used to looking at abstraction, because we've been looking at abstraction now for 70 years, that they will be, because of that training, they'll be motivated to solve the document, if you will?
That's a very interesting point that you brought up. For me, aesthetics plays a very important role in my work. And the subject matters of my work have always been very difficult. And I think when you talk about war, about conflict, it's really difficult for people to absorb, right, to process. Now, in order for an audience to approach an artwork, I think aesthetics plays that role in inviting people in. So it is a strategy that I have employed in my work for many years, that I use aesthetics so that it gives people this safe distance for people to approach the work without worrying so much about what I'm saying. But once they in that space confront the work, they will also confront the topic that the work is trying to discuss. Now with abstraction, I mean, I do come from that tradition of the late 90s of Dave Hickey, the idea of beauty, bringing back the beauty into the work. And abstraction, as we all know, like again, maybe I failed so badly in art school, but abstraction to me is like, when I learn about abstraction, I think about Kandinsky, I think about spirituality, right? And then, or you think about Matisse, you think about form, like simplification. For me, it's like I explained earlier, it's not so much about abstraction that I focus on, but I think it is that when people see the work within that tradition, I think it's relevant because of the colors, the shapes, that things that people can relate to, right? And that open up kind of possibilities. Now, abstraction for me, it's like I explained earlier, is beyond just the art discourse. Abstraction plays into this whole idea of like abstract information. How do you make it more visible, more real? Does that
Diaspora
make sense?
itself, in a way, is an abstraction. We can
It's
know.
an abstract concept,
Yeah.
right? You hear it, it's just like blah, blah, blah. It means nothing to you, but until you see it. And another thing I use with infographics and data visualization is that I play the same game that colonial powers set out to play with the map, which is to exaggerate, right? So if you look at all these dots, these big red dots on the map, and you look at the region, the topography, like of certain countries being so small, now this red dot that represents the number of refugees in Syria in the region, whether in Lebanon or in Turkey, is so huge. It's even bigger than Syria itself.
On the map.
On the map, right? It plays the importance of that, like the urgency of the situation.
It's using a language that, in America anyway, developed as a kind of retreat from geopolitical issues to take advantage of Americans' familiarity with that language to then make them look at geopolitical issues. It's a circularity that turns the thing upside down, which I think is.
Well, you gotta
works.
use what's available.
How did you come to start doing map-making projects with refugees?
It started with the Syria humanitarian crisis. I've been collecting infographics and data and statistics since 2012. And to me, it's just, how do I present a very complex set of data and information? I found only through map that I can start doing that. I can present this, right? I collected a lot of statistics. I analyzed all the numbers because, on one map, it may tell you a set of numbers, but if you look at different sources, you got different numbers. So I do collect these statistics from like different sources, and then I try to come up with what would be the most repeated statistics, and I will go with that. Hopefully that would be the correct number, but we can never know the reality in Syria as an example, as the war is still going on, right? So that's how I started.
So you took the information to a nonprofit, or I guess it was a museum. It was the Louisiana Museum.
It's a lot of agencies.
And so you asked for refugees who were interested in working with you, or how did that come to work?
You mean for the maps or for
for the maps first?
Well, for the maps, it's just simply the the data that I have collected from online sources. So that with the refugees, with the Syrian refugees. For the Vietnamese refugees, it's so much more, the project is so much more complicated.
It's representational, for one.
Right.
Those are photographs that then are being made into watercolors.
Right. I mean, it's also like ethical issues. With the current refugees, I don't really go and interview them obviously for ethical reasons. But with the Vietnamese former refugees, there's a period of over 40 years. So even for information, like records have already been released that you can study. Like I spent a lot of time at the UNHCR in Geneva to go through the archival materials. So with that, there's a lot of possibilities, there's a lot of materials for me to work with.
The project you did and researched in Geneva was to try to understand the migration of South Vietnamese to countries all over the world, in pretty much every habitable continent.
Right.
I mean, I don't think Antarctica, right? Probably not.
No.
No.
Mostly the West and the global South.
So this was a project that academic researchers really hadn't done. That you were building an extraordinary database of information about how the diaspora had worked and where people had gone and where those populations were now. When you have that much information that you have built yourself, how did you approach aestheticizing it? How did you approach what you want things to be or look like, or even with whom you wanted to make them?
You're asking $1 million question. It's a constant struggle and negotiation of, how to materialize all these research findings. It's intellectual negotiation, it's artistic negotiation. And, you know, one thing in my practice that I've always done without being taught is that I have no fear of employing different medium. Like I don't have fear in that. I just do whatever it takes. And if I don't know how to do something, I'll ask someone to help me with. I collaborate with somebody. And in terms of disciplines, I do the same thing with my research. You know, like people sometimes label me as an anthropologist, which I'm not. But I'm not afraid of you know, crossing boundaries, just so that I can learn and I can present. So same goes with the artworks. I think about what would be best present, you know, certain information that I have collected. Like the map is inevitable. I will always use maps no matter what. Because, you know, after so many years of practicing, it comes so easily, right? I mean, it's still very time consuming, but it comes easily when it gets to, like, you know, you try to project your work in terms of the mapping. But other mediums, I also employ it, and I mean, it's hard to break it down why
Well, let's
I
pick
just
two.
do this.
Let's pick two. So I can't think of anything almost more different than embroidery and video.
Right.
And yet you use both, and have used both or each. You have used each, both. I always get that wrong.
I use both.
This is why I have.
I use everything.
You use both. This is why I have editors. What type of information works in embroidery, and what type of information works in video? Because those are choices you have to have made.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're going through something, how do you go, oh, embroidery, oh, video?
You know, like I explained earlier about the interviewing the former Vietnamese refugees.
Which was presented, I think it was 19?
21 interviews. I selected 21 interviews, and we presented in one of the galleries. Yeah. So I already explained that, right? I mean, the history is so real. What else can I do besides present them as they are? Now with the embroidery or the mapping, when I discovered that the scale and the scope of the migration, it was just like a moment of revelation, right? I came across all these files of Vietnamese people in Africa and in the Middle East, right? And I told my dad, I said, Dad, Vietnamese people went to Central African Republic. And he's like, yeah, I know this one guy who went there. And I'm like, are you serious? Are you in touch with him? He's like, yes, I have his number. You want to call him? So then I called the guy and I said, oh, so I heard that you went there. And he's like, no, I went to Côte d'Ivoire. So I'm like, that's even better. Because I have this set of documents that I collected from the UNHCR on Côte d'Ivoire. It's so fragmented that you have no idea how people got there, right? And how many, and I only know because the UNHCR has a vast collection of documents. They don't know their content. There's just one conflict after another, one crisis after another. They don't have enough resources, human resources and like the actual funding to study. But maps
absorb ambiguity in that way.
Yes, and it shows, it mapped the routes of the Vietnamese flying to different parts of the world. And I have to, I collect all these information, and I also, you know, interviewing people really helps you to understand these rather abstract documents. Because it's just simply like Vietnamese and Côte d'Ivoire between 1982 to 1984. What does that tell you? Not much. But, you know, when I interviewed this one person, he actually told me how they got there. And it was just so excited, right? I was so excited. I went back to the documents. Everything makes sense. Now, how do I present this? Right? And he just, Côte d'Ivoire is one of the many countries that we ended up being. So I have to resort to map. And the work started from there. So it's not just one country, but other countries, and I have to learn all these flight routes during the 80s as well, like the 70s and the 80s. Commercial planes, like taking these Vietnamese refugees from refugee camps in Southeast Asia, in Japan, Hong Kong, to all over the world, right? The flight routes change too. So I study that, and then you do the whole process of elimination. So you see a lot of files that say, oh, they were at Chile, and later on you really looked and nobody went there because Chile didn't accept them. So that's elimination. So I just wanted to map the route of the Vietnamese migration just to show the scale and the scope of this migration.
The maps, one more thing and then we'll open it up for questions. I want to tell a little story about one of my experiences with one of your maps. For an exhibition at SF MoMA a number of years ago, you made 2 maps, single artwork, that addressed the history of natural disaster and displacement in San Francisco. The displacement, of course, happens after the 1906 earthquake and fire. You took an 1895 map of the city and laid it over the intensity of the earthquake. And then there's a map that shows the water system that provided San Francisco with fresh water. I think the first time I saw the piece, I didn't know this, but by the second time I saw it, I knew that my family had built that water system. And it provided a very, that one of my great-great-grandfathers built one dam, and then another great-great-grandfather built the next dam south. I found that in looking at the work and understanding the abstractions within it, that I could find my past, or a kind of my past, within it, which then led me to wanting to spend more time with the work and to find more stories in it. And I wonder if my experience aligns with what you hope happens when a viewer looks at your work. Do you hope they find a story of theirs or a story they can relate to hang their hat on that will then bring them into the rest of one of your maps?
Of course, I think it's really important that the audience see a piece of history that relates to them directly. I mean, that's all we can hope for. But at the same time, I hope that the work gives people an entry point into learning something that might not necessarily about them, but something that they could also relate to understand the world at large.
I found that when I had that experience with the San Francisco map, that when I went back and looked at your other maps, I began thinking less of systems and geopolitical systems or migration or the power systems that led to migration, and I began thinking of people.
Right.
And it was kind of like for me, it was a moment at which a lot of the work clicked into place. That I could, I guess that was about when I saw the Smithsonian show, and then there is a single person to whom a whole gallery more or less is devoted, and all of a sudden these abstractions became humanized, which I thought was which really worked for me. It was really great.
That's a really good summing up of the maps, actually, because when I started out making map about urban planning, I did think a lot about the human aspect in the map that is almost absent in a lot of maps that we look at, right?
It's like that was the whole point, was to chronicle populations and places rather than people.
Right.
And yours bring it back to people.
Right. So that's why the dots grow uncontrollably in my maps.
When you think of dots, did you, one more thing and then we'll do questions. There are certainly art historical references for dots, whether we're talking about pointillism, which then leads to impressionism, all those Seurat dots, or in pop art, say Kusama, Yayoi Kusama. Right. Were you interested in any art historical connections between dots and the way you use dots in maps?
Well, I love Yayoi Kusama, and I love polka dots. So, like my work is just so intense, like labor intensive and also like exhausting in terms of like researching and trying to understand the research materials. So at least I get that enjoyment of putting dots, like micro dots on my maps, that I could sit there for weeks and just putting little dots on the maps. And I think the dots are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and my vision is getting worse and worse and worse. But yes, I do love dots. I think it's just so simple like that.
There's like a several hundred-year visual cultural history of how artists have used dots to bring bigger pictures into focus.
Right.
And so I think
and
they work that way.
And it is the satisfaction of making a perfect circle.
Let's open it up. We have a microphone over here. If you have a question, raise your hand, and I think the microphone will get nearer.
Thank you. Hello. As a person who immigrated from the Middle East, like you talked about, like countries like Iraq, Syria, I really thank you for your work, and I really appreciate it. My question is, how much change do current foreign policies, current issues around the world impact you or your art, or like make you think about a project you did about a specific topic? I just want to know how much change does that impact on your artwork and yourself in general.
Thank you for your question. When I set out to do my Vietnam Exodus project, I had this vision of comprehensively chronicle, the stories of the people. But the more I started doing the research, the less I wanted to do it. But I asked myself the question of, why would I do this? Why would I revisit this one refugee history? And I learned that I'm doing it because I wanted to understand how policy impacts people with one group of this population, and hopefully using or shedding light into certain policies that was such a failure in the past, and hoping that somebody would listen to that, right? And then make changes in the policy, in asylum policy. That I learned very quickly, that it's from that angle that I wanted to anchor my work. So I did, in fact, because of my work on the Vietnamese refugees, and this is the justification of showing that project at Art Basel in 2016. For me, I struggle with that, like, why do I show it at this art fair, this refugee history? But, I thought it's the place where everyone would go to. And the next thing I knew, the human rights lawyers in Hong Kong that worked with the Vietnamese refugees in the past, they came knocking the booth. They demanded to see me because they wanted to talk about their experience. And I met policymakers that, drafted the very policy that I presented in the work. And then I also met former Vietnamese refugees, like a number of key players in that history. And from there, in 2017 and 2018, I was able to put together some panel discussions on asylum policies, bringing this human rights lawyers and also some of the Danish refugee agencies in Copenhagen that I've been working with, put them together at like 3 different panels in Hong Kong. And also with the former Vietnamese refugees that actually part of the panel and testifying on their experience on how these policies affected them. So it comes in a full circle, and I think that would just, it's just a small gesture and small step towards something that needs to be changed, but it takes time.
I know art students are taught that art can engage with the world, but they are not taught that art can change the world. And it sounds like what you're saying is you consciously made work to engage the world, wanting to change it, and that not only were you not afraid of that, but that was a goal, and it worked.
I hope it does. Like I said, it's a small step towards a very large system, and a system that is dictated by a very small group of people. So I think, to me, art creates awareness, and art creates that kind of safe space that people can engage without being so scared, and also for artists to be able to do it, but don't feel like a burden of having to fight for certain policies, because we can't, right? But we just hope that somehow we can contribute to the changes.
I think there's a nearly 200-year history of artists having an impact on America and changing America, and I think it's a story that, as historians and art historians, that our field doesn't do a particularly great job of focusing on. We tell the story of art within art's history, but we don't tell the story of art within these broader histories and its impact on these broader histories, and I wish we did.
Well, that's a good idea.
I'm trying. More books to come. Other questions? Back there on the right.
So I was just wondering, what features about your maps or embroideries do you think stand out when thinking about trying to communicate the severity of climate change to skeptics, or when highlighting the necessity of implementing renewable energies in the coming decades?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last sentence?
Yeah. So I was just saying, when trying to communicate the severity of climate change to skeptics, or when highlighting the necessity of implementing renewable energies in the coming decades.
So what is your question?
I was wondering, like, what key features on your maps, maybe like coloration or just certain symbols, maybe the dots, just what do you think makes it most simple for skeptics of climate change to really understand that this is a reality, or
that happened over 100 years ago?
Yeah.
Or almost 100 years
Yeah.
ago.
I noticed one of the things you did in the embroideries upstairs that address changing ocean temperature is the colors you used are red and blue, which are loaded colors in today's political America.
Right.
Conscious?
Well, it's coded. I think, the maps alone can't really tell the whole picture. I think that's why I have different components. I use different medium to hopefully convey the idea. So not just the maps. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Melissa?
One down here in the front.
Thank you for that conversation, and I'm actually struck by your discussion of maps and thinking about the role maps play in our world today. So, Tiffany, you create these very tactile maps, and you also engage with this historical tradition of having tactile maps, and yet our everyday engagement with maps today is mediated with a phone through a screen. So I'm wondering that tension between digital object and that tension between this tension, how do you navigate that, and how do you see that informing your own work, or does it inform your work?
That's interesting.
Well, one thing I learned is that by drawing maps, I know my directions better. I can navigate better. Like when I use Google Map or GPS, I feel so blind. Like I'm just a blind person. Like I don't really know the direction, and it really bothers me. I drew this one map of Sharjah in the UAE, the projection of Sharjah in 2025, right? And when I was drawing the map, I'd never been there to Sharjah. But after that, I went to Sharjah for the Sharjah Biennial. I actually recognized the street patterns. I recognized certain buildings.
Abstractions locking into place.
Well, I mean, you draw the map and you know your directions. I did not get lost. So, I mean, it's so important for me. That's why, like, the act of drawing the map is, like, so important. Because I can use digital technology, right? But I refuse to, I mean, maybe eventually I'm gonna use it, but right now I still refuse to get there, just because I feel like by actually drawing it, I learned so much. And about history too, right?
There's a reference in the maps, intentional or not, also in the way you use dots to printing processes. And how screen printing is a dot-driven, I don't know about driven, dot manifested. Pixel. Yeah, it's a process, and with the way we use maps now, I mean, sure, but the pixels are super small, but it's a very different experience than you know, the 150 years of map making that preceded it, which your maps refer to.
But even just looking at a map, right? Right now we have only like the screen of this size.
But a big map is a whole different
right,
experience.
to understand how to get, so you don't see the whole picture. But when you actually look at the actual map, you see the whole picture. You have a sense of direction. And you see how the world more interconnected, because right now we only see that part that we need to get from here to there. But you don't see the whole city. You know, how do you connect to communities if you don't really know where other people live? You just only know your immediate area of where you usually go to.
We're also taught practically from birth that maps have authority, that maps are to be believed. And that's not always been true throughout human history, of course, including ours. And your maps subvert that idea. Your maps are propositions rather than answers, or rather than determinations.
Yeah, I think that's what art does, right? Posing more questions than giving the answers, providing the answers.
Yeah. In the middle?
To move us off the question of maps, I was quite taken when I first heard of your work that was at the Smithsonian, the American, and the title that was for your show was "The Past is the Prologue," which, when I first read it, I must have said it at least 5 or 10 times upon meeting other individuals, and that title was able to be translated and transferred into other areas of life. And so my question to you is, as you have just said that you have scratching the wall of memory, I find that to be very moving and very pointed. So are you the one who selects the titles for your shows, or do you put that off to someone else? I hope it's just you.
Well, most of the time I have to come up with, always, I have to come up with the titles. But for, a show of such scale, like at the Smithsonian, I give them, I don't even know how many lists of titles that I could come up with. And we work through that. And then it's a constant negotiation and discussion. But yeah, so that was my title. I spoke to one of my former professors, and I was just like, I have so many titles. What should I go with? But yeah, it was my title. with a lot of input, it's particularly that show, but other shows too. Sometimes I give a title and with curatorial input, some curators will be like, but we love your poetic titles. This is just so direct. But then my titles of my artworks are mostly very direct too, right?
Except for the bison one, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of them are direct. And I think that just happened more and more often, that I thought, maps are so abstract. The history sounds so abstract. I cannot make it, too mythological. I have to be like really direct with the titles. But that's more like on the actual artworks rather than the titles of the exhibitions.
If you're interested in Tiffany's use of words and language, log on to YouTube and search for her Smithsonian American Art Museum lecture. It's about 45, 50 minutes long, and it's a fabulously written, flowing narrative through Vietnam's history, America's history in Vietnam, Tiffany's family history, snapshots, artworks. It's this, I can't believe there was any discussion with them about that. Because that was all authorial. It was very authorial. And it's just a beautiful flowing mixture of work, personal history, lecture. It's the 48-minute Smithsonian American Art Museum lecture. I don't know how else to search for it on YouTube. Right? That
Yeah.
fair?
Well, thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah.
Just a warning, it's very dense.
It's dense, but that's
a
why it's
bombardment
it
of
takes a couple
words
minutes
and
to get used to the
images.
density, but once you do, it really it's like dots in a map or something, or like the embroidery of the world map of South Vietnamese migration. It all just kind of clicks into place, and then once you're about 7 minutes into it, you can't look at anything else until it's done.
Thank you.
Others? We'll take this one and then just one more after this.
What stuck out to me while you were talking was, or the conversation, you casually mentioned doing research on airplane flights or other moments that would be, to any historian, would be deep archival research that would be a necessity to completing a book project. So I was wondering if you could either speak to the process of going to the archive, or if you have an anecdote from your times in the archive, or just kind of speaking to that sense of integrating the archive into your work and how that influences it.
That's a particularly good question, because among art students at the moment, when I talk to art students, the archive is something they're really interested in as both a concept and a place to go do things.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we work with archives in order to subvert that kind of authority that archives give us. The reason I'm saying that, because in 2005, a group of human rights organization, a group of the human rights defender, discovered a historical national police archives in Guatemala that was left there in ruins. There was, I forgot the actual number, but there was like 80,000 million sheets of paper or something on that level that really testified to the level of violence and who were behind the violence and all the killings and forced disappearance that took place during the Civil War, especially in the Guatemala city. And it's actually pinpointed to the crimes that were committed by the National Police of Guatemala. Before that, during the Civil War, we talk a lot about the massacre in the highlands that conducted by the military. But because of that archives, people were able to put, to put the face in the names to the faces, and actually brought some people to court. So it's really important to engage with archives, whether you are students or any students of histories, of law. My experience with the archives at the UNHCR is that I recently made this work that mapped the exact locations of the piracy attacks of Vietnamese refugees in the Gulf of Thailand. And I got the data and also the exact coordinates from the archives of the UNHCR. When I saw that, it was just like I won a lottery. Although it just like selected cases between 85 and to 86, but it was such a revelation, right? I mean, you've heard so much about these attacks, and I even have videos, testimonies of the victims. But to see the actual locations makes it all more real. So it's really hard for me to not resort to archives. I don't know if that answers your question, but
The factual and authority, the borrowing authority from the archives and bringing it into a body of artwork, I think is a really important point.
right.
I mean, Lewis Hines photographs changed child labor in America because they were factual, because they had the authority of truth.
Right.
And archives
And
function
I think
some of the same way.
another thing that I also learned is that, when you come with a much more open mind, you tend to find more interesting information. I think the reason I was able to map the scale and the scope of the Vietnamese refugees after 1975 was that I did not expect to be able to find such materials. If I was an academic, already got all my theories figured out, coming to the archives to gather materials that could, help me to make the case for my book, I would be more focused. But I was there when I requested certain files, and I requested so much because I didn't really have, I know that I did my homework, so I know a certain part of history that I wanted to focus on, but I didn't have a theory to build upon. So I went there, and actually when they brought out all the materials for my week of going there and doing it every day, and they would be like, after a few days, they're like, oh, you just scanned everything. And I'm like, yeah, I don't have time. I have to scan everything. And they're like, so you don't know what you're looking for? And I'm like, yes and no. Yeah, I don't, but I found things that going through them, I could see what I needed, and I scanned them so I can study later on when I go home. I can't do it all here because I have a very limited amount of time in the archives.
The best research strategy is that you, yes and no, know what you're looking for. Because if there's enough of the no, I don't know what I'm looking for, then you're open to finding.
Right. And I was not even shy about that.
Yeah.
I didn't know. What can I do?
One more. Over here.
My question has to do with the display upstairs with the black bison and one white bison. And for you, what does the white bison stand for? And then compare that with the one I've seen on the screen behind you, which is a large herd of clear glass bison. And how did you make that choice? Was that an aesthetic choice, or does it have a meaning to have them black or clear?
Thank you for the question. For the bison upstairs, the white bison, I read that according to the Indians, the Native Americans, the white bison stand for a very sacred animal. So well, my choice of using black glass for the bison is just to correspond to their actual color. And, you know, I think the history is so real to many Americans in the region and even just in California as well. I think it's important to have the color that really represents the animal.
And there were white bison, and it was a genetic mutation, so they did.
Oh, is that right?
I think that's right. I think that, yeah.
But it's supposed to be sacred.
Yes, yes. But that's how there was familiarity with, that was the source of the.
Right. But for other groups of animals, it's not bison, they just like different types of animals. And you know what, when we talk about history and memories, it just so, sometimes it seems so vague, and sometimes it feels like it's so impossible to access memory and history. And I think that's my choice of using this transparent glass for those animals, because something that you look, that you feel, it's just so fleeting. You know, it doesn't have a presence, but at the same time, it does. It's an object, and it's a hard object, but it feels so like just a fleeting memory of the past. But then I use a lot of them to make my point.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.